All right, let's jump right into this explainer. Today, we're pulling back the curtain on the ancient world's most dominant and, honestly, most terrifying war machine. Prepare to unlearn pretty much everything Hollywood taught you, because the reality of how the Roman legion built its absolute supremacy is way more brutal and far more brilliant than just simple battlefield heroics.
Okay, let's dive into this because we have to immediately challenge a massive historical myth. It's incredibly tempting to look at a map of the Roman Empire at its absolute height and just assume that Roman soldiers were, natural supermen, that they were somehow genetically gifted warriors, or taller, stronger, maybe naturally fiercer than anyone else. But the historical record tells us the exact opposite. They were farmers, they were the landless poor, they were remarkably average men. So how did they actually do it?
Well, the answer lies right at the heart of our explainer today. The Roman army won because of a ruthless, systematic method. For over 1,000 years, Rome operated on this one unwavering idea that an entirely ordinary man, if properly trained and heavily disciplined, could be transformed into the deadliest instrument of war ever assembled. It wasn't about individual glory, it wasn't about singular military genius, it was an absolute, literal devotion to process.
And that systematic transformation began the absolute second a recruit raised his right hand and swore the sacramentum. Now, this wasn't just signing a standard enlistment contract. For the new recruit, the tiro, his old civilian life was instantly erased. He was branded or tattooed, and from that very breath onward, his legion became his only family, the silver eagle standard became his god, and his centurion became his absolute judge.
But here is where it gets incredibly grounding. Before this new recruit was ever allowed to touch a sword, he had to learn how to walk. And I mean, walk Roman. Basic training started with marching 18 modern miles in just 5 summer hours, day after brutal day. It was the absolute physical foundation upon which the entire empire was built. Now, what's really interesting about this is that they weren't just taking a brisk walk in a light tunic. Oh no. They marched at that brutal, rapid pace while carrying a massive saddled load weighing 20 kilograms. That is over 44 pounds of incredibly awkward, heavy gear strapped to a wooden pole resting right on their shoulders. And that's completely independent of their heavy armor and weapons. Just think about this staggering amount of gear for a second. Rations for several days, a bronze cooking pot, 2 massive wooden stakes just for building walls, a saw, a sickle, a basket for moving earth, a heavy chain, and a pickaxe. A Roman legionary was effectively a walking quartermaster. It beautifully illustrates that a Roman soldier was just as much a heavy laborer as he was a frontline fighter. This sheer physical reality was so striking that when the first-century historian Josephus actually watched the Roman army moving through Judea, he wrote down this incredible observation. He said, "The Romans did not so much march as work, because every step built the road they walked on." Think about that. They literally terraformed the landscape as they moved. Once they could finally march, they were taught to fight. And the Roman method of combat was defined by brutal, cold efficiency. They trained with wooden swords and wicker shields that were deliberately twice the weight of their real weapons. Why? So that when they finally drew real steel, it felt as light as a feather. And they were trained exclusively to thrust, never slash. Slashing, as the ancient military manuals explicitly pointed out, wastes a massive amount of energy, exposes your arm, and honestly often only results in a non-lethal flesh wound. Thrusting, on the other hand, was the ultimate equalizer. Trainers hammered home one specific, incredibly visceral rule. It took just 2 inches of iron driven into a man's belly to completely end him. Just 2 inches! That was it. Step behind your massive shield, punch the sword forward 2 inches, withdraw, and you are ready for the next opponent. It wasn't glorious, it was quite literally an assembly line of death. And when that grueling march ended, and the fighting practice was over, you guessed it, the day still wasn't done. The army then had to build a fortress. No matter how utterly exhausted they were, no matter how brief the halt, they excavated a 3-meter deep ditch, built a rampart from the earth, planted those exact stakes they'd been carrying all day, and laid out the exact same grid of crossing streets. Now, this wasn't a lack of architectural imagination. It was pure tactical genius. A soldier who had served 5 years could find his exact tent in a completely foreign camp in the pitch dark. But more importantly, an army that builds a literal fortress every single night can never be surprised while resting. Let's move to and see how this builds, because all of that individual marching, thrusting, and digging ultimately culminated into massive 1,000-man tactical formations. Think of the famous testudo, or tortoise formation, designed to lock shields tightly against missile fire, or the triplex oases. These weren't chaotic, disorganized scrums.
Guided only by the blast of a horn and the visual dip of a standard, 1,000 men could shift formations in the pouring rain, even with half their unit dead.
But right here, we really have to shift our focus, because physical training only produced a competent soldier. What produced a truly terrifying Roman legionary was their psychological conditioning. It was a completely unique architecture of discipline, relying on the absolute most extreme versions of the stick and the carrot you can possibly imagine.
Let's start with the stick, which was, honestly, by the standards of any age, utterly terrifying. Sure, minor infractions cost a man his food or his pay, but serious infractions? They cost him his life. Take the fustuarium. If a sentry fell asleep on his watch, he wasn't executed by some faceless firing squad. No, he was beaten to death by his own messmates, the very comrades whose lives he had just endangered by sleeping. The accountability was ruthlessly, physically enforced by your closest peers.
And then there was the ultimate punishment: decimation. If a unit broke in battle or fled in cowardice, they faced this dreaded ritual. 1 in 10 men were chosen by a completely random lottery and then brutally clubbed to death by the remaining 9. So the crucial point is that, while decimation was actually incredibly rare, its looming memory ensured one vital psychological truth. To a Roman soldier, disgrace was infinitely worse than death.
And this brilliantly illustrates the flip side, right? Because that terrifying stick was matched by unbelievable rewards for valor, the carrot. Save a comrade's life in battle, you get the corona civica, a simple oak wreath that literally placed you above senators at public events. First man over an enemy city wall, you get a crown made of solid gold. Promotions, cash bounties. The Roman army was a ruthless meritocracy where sheer undeniable bravery could entirely rewrite your social destiny.
Holding this entire crazy system of extreme punishments and extreme rewards together was the relentless, rhythmic monotony of daily life. Parades and heavy drill before dawn, eating simple rations of porridge and salted pork, standing watch in grueling 4-hour shifts, and above all else, digging. Shovels and pickaxes were honestly just as central to their identity as swords. Whether it was ditches, latrines, roads, or palisades, the Roman legionary always dig.
When you contrast all of this with Rome's enemies, the absolute genius of the system becomes incredibly clear. Individually, the Gauls were taller. The Germanic tribes were arguably braver and way more ferocious in single combat. The Greeks were undeniably better educated. But the Roman soldier? He didn't rely on individual flair. He relied on exact, painful, monotonous repetition. He won because he was conditioned to do the incredibly difficult, terrifying thing in the exact same way as the man on his left and the man on his right.
And history proves this thesis perfectly, because the moment this system failed, Rome failed. Trace the early disasters of the late Republic all the way to the agonizing, slow collapse of the Western frontier in the 5th century, and they all stem from the exact same root cause. The empire didn't crumble because barbarian swords suddenly got sharper. It crumbled the exact moment Roman commanders stopped training their men hard enough, stopped punishing them fairly, and just abandoned the method.
Ultimately, Rome's lasting legacy on the battlefield wasn't a story of legendary individual heroes like an Achilles or a Hercules. It was the invention of an unbreakable, standardized system. It was the profound realization that ordinary, average people, locked into a flawless architecture of discipline, can achieve things that are quite literally world-conquering.
Which leaves us with the truly provocative thought to end on today. 2,000 years later, look around at our modern world. Think about military boot camps, massive corporate training structures, or even our rigorous educational systems. How many of our modern institutions are still silently echoing this ancient Roman method, relying on exact repetition, standardized drills, and the erasure of the individual to build a stronger whole? It's definitely something to think about the next time you see a group moving perfectly as one. Thanks for exploring this with me, and keep questioning the history that shapes our world.